All right. So everyone, you could probably hear us chatting. I'm Emily. It's nice to see you. And I've got Juliana with us. She's a highly experienced immigration professional with over 6 years of expertise in the field of U.S. immigration. Through her career, she has held various positions, including international student advisor, international admissions counselor, and immigration paralegal. Currently, she manages immigration relations, all immigration related operations for the Aspen Group, and is responsible for overseeing the immigration practices of the company. So she is the one you want to hear from today. Juliana, thank you so much for being on. We're really grateful to have you and have you share your expertise with the students. So I'll have you take it away.
Awesome. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me again. I always enjoy talking to students and talking to people, and as you will see, I'm very passionate about immigration. So before I get started, let me just share a little bit more about my personal experience as an immigrant. So I've been an immigrant. I joined the U.S. I entered the U.S. a few years ago on a student visa. So I went through this entire process, not necessarily the H-1B and the TN that we're going to talk about, but like I know how it feels to be an immigrant in this country. I know how anxious we may be expecting, processes. So that's what makes me so passionate about working for immigrants today. These days, I'm already a U.S. citizen, but I still enjoy and I love working to bring more immigrants to the U.S. because I think it's the core to bring diversity to this country. So let's get started. So about
Juliana, I hate to interrupt you, but when I gave you over duties, it stopped recording. Would you mind pressing record in the bottom?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, it's at the bottom bar. It just won't let me do it. It's asking the host to do it. Sorry, guys, we were on to a good start.
It says here that it's recording to me. It says like I can either pause recording or stop recording.
Perfect. As long as it's recording.
I think it is. It shows here for me that it's recording.
Perfect. Sorry, guys. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. We're going to talk about the Aspen Dental immigration sponsorship program. I'm not going to talk about all the visas that we consider when hiring a foreign national, but I'm going to talk about the most common ones. So let's get started with the TN. So the TN visa is designed for Canadians and Mexican citizens. That's a visa special for signatories of the NAFTA agreement. And the eligibility is obviously just Canadians and Mexicans. And for someone to get, so for a Canadian, for example, get a TN visa, they can apply at U.S. port of entries across the border, land border and airports. For Mexicans to get TN visas, they do have to apply at the U.S. consulate in Mexico. For Canadians who are in the U.S. with any type of visa, F1, for example, we can file for the TN from inside the United States. So the candidate wouldn't have to leave the country just to apply for the visa if they don't want to. As far as validity, we would always request a TN for 3 years at a time, and it can be renewed indefinitely. I like to start talking about the TN first because I like to say that the TN, within our immigration system, is by far the less regulated visa. So that means it's a little bit easier to process it. It doesn't mean it's by less regulated, I mean there's no additional compliance for the sponsor, they have to comply with prevailing wages, and by prevailing wages I mean specific salaries and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more flexible visa in a way, but unfortunately it's not available to all nationalities. Feel free to ask questions on the Q&A, and Emily, feel free to stop me. Absolutely. If there are any questions popping up. So that's the TN visa. A couple of things that people usually are concerned about the TN. The TN is a visa that's considered one in 10. So meaning when, let's just say I'm applying for a TN visa at the Canadian border, I'm a Canadian. So at the time of application, I have to have the intention to return back to my home country. In that case, Canada. So some people will get confused and think if they join us on a TN visa, they will never be able to transition to a green card. And that's not entirely true. This intent to return to your home country, you're allowed to change your mind in a way. So meaning at the time you're crossing the border and applying for your visa, obviously you do have to have that intent, but let's just say in a few months, you change your mind, then it's okay for you to change your mind, and therefore you could pursue a green card. You will see across internet forums that TNs can never get a green card. So that's not entirely true. Obviously, if you're crossing the border, applying for your TN just already with the intention to stay forever, and the officer do ask you, do you have the intention to stay in the United States and never go back? And then if you answer yes, then they will deny your visa, obviously. But in most cases, what happens in practice is that people will have the intention to return back to their home country at the time of application, because the TN is a non-immigrant and temporary visa. So you never know what's going to happen. So all that to say that there are ways where TN people working under TN, they could transition to a green card at some point. I see there's some questions
Yes, we've got a great question. It says, what if you have a spouse that has a TN visa?
That's a really good question. So if you have a spouse who is holding a TN visa, unfortunately, as a dependent of your spouse, you cannot work in the United States. So let's just assume that you also have a Canadian citizenship, then you would be able to get the TN yourself. Okay, so then the next most common visa, and then I should say the most regulated visa within our U.S. immigration system, is definitely H-1B. And I'm talking about work visas, by the way. The H-1B is definitely the most regulated visa in a contract of the TN. So just as a summary, the H-1B is a visa category that allows employers to petition for foreign nationals in specialty occupations. So in your specific case, I'm assuming you are all, going to dental school, or you're already a doctor. So dentistry is one of those occupations. Eligibility, that's when things get a little bit tricky in a way. So the H-1B, as you probably have heard or have seen online, for someone who never went through what we call H-1B lottery, they have to go through this process at least once and be selected through this lottery to then acquire the H-1B visa. And I put it here that for a cap subject employer. So that means employers who are for profit, employers who are not exempt to who are not exempt of the lottery, they must submit application and registration in the lottery for their candidates. So in other words, let's just say you want to join us. Aspen practices, they are for profit. They are not exempt of the cap. And by cap, I mean the H-1B lottery. So, if you were to join us, you would have to go through the H-1B lottery unless you have gone through this process, a few years ago or recently. The reason why this H-1B, someone for joining us on an H-1B would have to go through this lottery is because the Congress has established a cap of how many H-1B visas could be issued per fiscal year. So there's a total of 85,000 visas available every year. From these 85, 20,000 of these visas are assigned for people who came to the United States and received a master's degree or higher. from a US university. So let's just say if you have a master's degree or if you are going to a DMD or DDS program, then you would have this extra chance within one round of the lottery. Then people who only have a bachelor's degree, they would be subjected to the 65,000 remaining. That's for anyone who has a bachelor's degree or higher for in a specialty occupation. So if you're attending to a DDS or DMD program, then you most likely would be eligible for to be then thrown into your application would be thrown into this 20,000 pile, and then if you're not selected, you would have that extra chance in the 65,000. Unfortunately, we wish that the Congress had expanded that cap, but they didn't. So that's why we have every H-1B candidate virtually has to go through an H-1B lottery. Once you receive that lottery, once you are selected, actually, then we would submit the H-1B petition, and your H-1B would be available, or it would be effective on October 1st of the same year. Why is that? Because October 1st is the first day of the fiscal year. So actually the H-1B lottery is ran for the following year. So that's why the visas would be effective on October 1st. Couple important things here. If you are to join us, we're going to have to register you into the lottery, it's really, really important that you maintain your visa status, you maintain a valid visa status until September 30th. Because again, H-1B would be effective on October 1st. And even if we file before, which we would, you have to maintain a valid status until then. And as far as validity, the H-1B visas generally, someone can be on H-1B visa in general for 6 years. And then we would apply for initial 3 years, and we could request an additional 3 years extension. There are some exceptions. The exception is, let's just say you are an Indian national or you're Chinese national. Unfortunately, as you probably have heard, there is a waiting line for you to get a green card. So let's just say if we file for, an Aspen employer file for a green card sponsorship for you, you would get up to a certain point, and then you would be placed in line, and that line is very long. And if you have what we call I-140 approved, which is that certain point I just mentioned, then you would be eligible to extend your H-1B beyond the 6 years while you wait for your placing line for you to actually file for the green card. That's the only exception. Otherwise, if you're not Indian national or Chinese national, you wouldn't be able to extend the H-1B beyond the 6 years under the circumstances. And also, it's really, really important that I emphasize that it's not any Indian or Chinese national that who would be able to extend their visa, their H-1B beyond the 6 years. You have to have that specific process approved, which is the I-140, as I mentioned. So, it's just for a very specific group of people where, they would be eligible for, extend their H-1B beyond the 6 years. Questions? I see there are several questions here.
Yes. So
awesome.
The first one says, so we get OPT. Does it mean we work on it in the current year and we are on it? Does Aspen apply for H-1B during the OPT period?
That's a really good question. So there are a couple ways, you could join us. You could sign up for, you could sign a letter of agreement with an Aspen employer even before you graduated. And then, before the upcoming H-1B lottery, I should say next month, you sign a letter of agreement with an Aspen employer. Then we would be able to include you into the lottery for this year, even before you graduate. Obviously, by the time you're selected, And by the time we actually file for the petition for selected people, you have to have your diploma. And then you still would have to file for OPT because, again, remember, you have to keep a valid status until September 30th. But then we would be able to give you what we call extra shot into the lottery. If you are not selected, you would still work for us for the upcoming 12 months, and then you would have an extra shot next year while you are on OPT. Hope I answered your question.
Awesome. I think so. I'll let you know if I get more. It says a similar question, but for H-1B visa, what if I have an H-1B visa? Can my spouse come into the States and work?
Excellent question. Depends. So remember what I just mentioned, that there are some exceptions for people extending that 6 years. So let's just say you are one of these people. So you have an H-1B, you're an Indian national or a Chinese national. You got the I-140 approved, which is it's part of the green card process. Then your spouse would then be eligible for an employment authorization in connection with an H-1B dependent visa. Now, generally speaking, H-1B dependents are not eligible for employment authorization. That's the only exception because there is an understanding that if the H-1B primary holder, have to wait many years, and you have that exception of extending your visa beyond the 6 years, your spouse should be able to somewhat work somewhat have an opportunity to work in the United States too. So that's the only exception. If you're an Indian national, if you are a Chinese national, and you have the I-140 approved.
That is wonderful. And I think I just have somebody confirming. They say, so initially till October 1st, you're on OPT. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. If you are eligible, obviously, for an OPT, so then, yeah, you would be on OPT until October 1st. So our usual recommendation for candidates who are going through this process before they graduated is that they do apply for their OPT regardless, because again, we never know, what's going to happen with the lottery. So you should still apply, because then, if you're selected, we file the H-1B petition, you still have to maintain your status. And we would also want to have you starting working with us as soon as you're eligible for, and we wouldn't want to wait until October 1st until your H-1B visa kicked in.
I have one that says, what is the I-40 special Indian national requirement? That they didn't understand what that was.
Okay, yes, thank you. So what I was explaining is, for Indian nationals, unfortunately, they have to wait in line many, many years until they can actually file for the very last step of their green card. So when, an employer, let's just say I'm an Aspen employer and I want to sponsor Emily. Emily is an Indian national in my example. We would file for, her H-1B, should have her H-1B, and then we would start what we call PERM process, which is one of the several ways someone can get a green card. So we would go through the various steps of the PERM process, and then we would get to the I-140, which is the step 4 of out of 5 steps for you to get the green card, for Emily to get the green card in my example. So Emily, you would get to the I-140, which is the step 4 of this process for her to get a green card, and then she would be placed in line. There's a line that we call priority date, which is essentially for Indian nationals and Chinese nationals. They just have to wait several years until they can actually file for their green card. And that placing line is set by a date. So the date that we initiate this specific process that I just mentioned, the PERM process, in my example for Emily, is what it will designate her placing line. So right now, Immigration Services is accepting green card application for people with priority dates from about 10 years ago. So Indian nationals and Chinese nationals, they have to wait a little bit less, but they would still have to wait somewhere between 2 to 5 years, and Indian nationals would have to wait somewhere between being very optimistic, 5 to 10 years. Right now we're more like in the 10 years waiting period. So during this 10 years, let's just say you would max, Emily, my example, would max out her 6 years, right? So, she's only allowed to stay in the United States under H-1B for 6 years. But then what will you do? Like, would she have to return home and wait 10 more years to then have her employer to file for her green card? That wouldn't make sense. So to address this, people in her condition, and in my example, Chinese and Indian nationals who have gone up to a certain point of their green card process, sponsorship, they are allowed to extend their H-1B beyond the maximum of 6 years. They can keep extending it until they are eligible to finally file for the very last step of their green card, which is the green card application in itself. For Indians and Chinese nationals, their spouses, if they are in H-1B, obviously, their spouses would be eligible to have an employment authorization while they also wait for that process. Because keep in mind, the green card process, usually that's not obviously always the case, usually is a process for the family, not necessarily just for that one person. Obviously, the employer will sponsor that one individual, but their family will be eligible to join them in the green card application. So in that specific case, again, in my example, Emily is an Indian national, and we would have filed for the green card for her. She would have got to that certain step, and then she's waiting in line. So in her specific case, she would be eligible to extend her H-1B beyond the 6 years, and her spouse would also be eligible to get an employment authorization in connection with their dependent visa. Is it a little bit more clear? I hope so.
I'll ask for him, but I think so. I had one that asked me, do you know if there's options if OPT gets over and your H-1 doesn't get picked? Is there any other option to work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's a question that I have to usually address or answer every year after the H-1B lottery is completed. So as of right now, Aspen, all I can say in this call is that we are trying to work and find other ways where we can still keep candidates who max out their OPT and who have not been selected into the lottery. But as of right now, like a usual pathway for those candidates is that one, we have to terminate them because they're not eligible to continue to work with us beyond the expiration of their employment authorization. In this specific case, the OPT, right? So they are terminated, and in most cases, what they do is they find an employment with what we call H-1B cap exempt institution. What are cap exempt institutions? They are exactly the opposite of cap subject institutions. So meaning their employees would not have to go through the lottery. Which institutions are those? Usually universities, public universities that receive public money, or universities that are working in research, or community health centers that they're not for profit and serve underprivileged communities. Those usually are the employers who are eligible to file for an H-1B pretty much at any time of the year. They do not have to go, their employees do not have to go through the lottery. So to answer your question, one of the solutions are for our doctors who max out their OPT, they're not selected, they have no other form of employment authorization to continue to work with us. We would have to unfortunately terminate them. But then they usually find employment with a cap exempt institution. In some cases, they keep in touch with our practice owners, and our practice owners still try to bring them back in upcoming H-1B lotteries until they can finally be selected. We actually had a case last year from someone who went through this entire process. He kept in touch with his previous employer, to a point where she wanted to submit a registration for him, and he was actually selected. So it was really, really good because he worked for a few months, not a few months, I believe it was about 8 months with a cap exempt institution, and then we finally brought him back, and he's right now on the pathway to get a green card eventually.
Awesome. Just a few more questions. One is really specific. It says, I had an H-1B before going to dental school. I had to switch to an F-1 to be a full-time student in dental school. What's the process for H-1B after I finish school?
So in your specific case, I would actually need to know more. If you went through, I'm assuming you went through the lottery, you were selected. If you have not maxed out your 6 years, so let's just say you still have, like, I don't know, 3 years left on your H-1B, then upon graduation, once, you have your license, you have your diploma, then we would be able to simple file for an H-1B change of status. So, like, the same way you change from H-1B to F-1, you could then change again to H-1B. You obviously, if you did go through the lottery, you wouldn't have to go through the lottery again. We just file for a new, for an H-1B and a change of status. And, assuming everything goes well, you would be, just approved and start working with us as soon as your H-1B is approved.
Perfect. The next one says, and I think this may be for a different slide, but we'll see, how long would this process take for a Canadian resident?
So it depends. So it depends on the process, really. If you're asking about the TN, assuming you are you are Canadian citizen, sorry, then, the process for you to get a TN is pretty straightforward. If you're willing to drive to the border, then, it's a matter of, couple weeks for you to get your TN package and be ready to just drive up to the border or, fly in and apply for your TN. Now, if you're asking about, getting a green card, and so then the process depends. It really depends on the case. Oops, sorry. Well, that was at the end of my presentation anyways. It depends on the process, really. I would need to know more information about your specific case to make an assessment of how long it could take. Any more questions?
Yes, they are flying in now. I see, is the TN valid for Canadian PR, not a citizen, but people with Canadian residency?
No, unfortunately not. You must be a Canadian citizen. That's a requirement. So Canadian residents, unfortunately, they are not eligible for a TN unless they become a Canadian citizen.
Sorry, I got myself stuck on mute. This one says, last year my H-1 was picked, but I couldn't file it because I got admission into dental school. Is it possible, since I was picked, that it can be filed again next year?
You would have to go through the entire lottery. You would have to be selected again. Because if you, in your question, it sounds like, the employer who registered you into the lottery, they never actually file for the H-1B, petition. So, you were counted towards the, that 85,000 cap for last year, but, your visa was never approved. So, because the H-1B lottery is like a two-phase process. So you have to complete phase 1 and 2. So phase 1 is the registration. And then if you're selected, then there's the phase 2. Your employer must file for, the petition. It has to be approved. And, you have to take the position after October 1st to then activate your H-1B. So based on the information you provided in your question, I would say that you would have to just go through the entire, lottery again process, unfortunately. But I mean, if you do join us, we would be happy to, include you into the H-1B registration. Hopefully you would be selected again.
Are you allowed to travel to your home country after, I think it says I-140 is approved and waiting in line for a green card?
Yes. Well, actually, it depends on the visa. I should say, if you're an H-1B, then you are allowed to just travel back and forth. It's like you can continue your life as you didn't have the I-140 approved until, because that I-140 approved does not give you any visa status. So what's going to determine whether you can travel or not is your current visa status. In a TN too, you could keep traveling back and forth, up until your priority date becomes current, meaning you're able to actually submit your green card application. Then we would have to strategize, when, if you're in a TN, and then if you are in an H-1B visa, you can just keep traveling back and forth, as long as you have a valid visa to enter the country. That's a really important thing to emphasize. You have to have a visa stamp on your passport. If you don't have a visa stamp, then you have to get one before you re-enter the United States.
Perfect. I'm getting a lot of thank yous too, by the way. This
Awesome.
this one says, do you sponsor EB2 right away and apply for a green card?
That's a really good question. So our recommendation to practice owners within Aspen Network is that they evaluate their candidates for a green card within 12 months or after 12 months of employment. That would be especially important for people who are going through the H-1B lottery, because it's really important that you secure what we call an underlying employment authorization before we actually start that green card process. And the reason being is because that process takes longer. And as I said, the green card sponsorship will be running in the background for a very long time, especially if you're an Indian or Chinese national. So, that run in the background does not allow you to work if you don't have any other type of visa. So the answer would be, obviously, it's up to the practice owner, but our recommendation is that we wait about 12 months. And it's also because the process that we do, which is the PERM, and answering already, yes, we do, it's usually EB2, the employment-based category. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's just there are several categories for an employer to sponsor a foreign national. There's EB1, EB2, EB3. So, the EB2 is just one of those categories. We do, usually our perms for dentists are for EB2, and they have the possibility to downgrade to EB3 if they need to, if their priority date is benefiting them. But yeah, so for you to get to that point where, the I-140 that I mentioned earlier, you would, there's a process. It takes a little bit long, and nothing on your employment can change. So meaning, let's just say you join us, next month, February, and then you are really, really high perform doctor, and your practice owner owns multiple locations, and they're seeing that you would be a better fit in a busier location because you're really performing really well. If that practice owner had started that process, the PERM process, / green card sponsorship, right as soon as you started, they would have to restart that process once they move your location. Once you transition to working for a different location, because again, nothing can change. Your work site cannot change. Your job title cannot change. So if you join us in an associate dentist position, you potentially wouldn't be able to, be promoted until you actually get your green card. So, or until you actually get to the I-140, I should say. So it's really important that in this first 12 months, the practice owners will evaluate whether you're a good fit for, that specific location. And, you also will evaluate whether we are a good fit for your career aspirations. So we realize that during this first 12 months of employment, changes happen, people get promoted, they're assigned to busier offices. So, or sometimes they want to change their work site. So it's a time frame that we see as an adjustment period. And therefore, practice owners shouldn't start the perm sponsorship because, if anything changed, they would just have to restart it all.
Awesome. Probably a pretty simple one. It says, can you travel back home to your home country if you're on OPT?
Excellent question. So generally, you should definitely ask your international student advisor, but generally speaking, you should be able to travel. But I usually defer OPT questions, specific questions to international student advisors, because they, schools are responsible for managing the OPT, because OPT is a benefit in connection with your student visa. So they kind of own the entire process. Generally, I should say yes, you probably should be able to, travel based on my previous experience as an international student advisor, but always consult your international student advisor, international students office before you're planning a trip abroad, just to ensure that, everything is fine, and they will, they will endorse your I-20 for you to travel.
Perfect. This one says, if you have an I-140 approved for EB2 NIW, you knew right away before joining Aspen, does it change anything?
It depends on where you are in that process. So it shouldn't change anything. If anything, let's just say you're already ahead, your green card application pending, you have an employment authorization in connection with that petition or application, then you wouldn't need a visa from us. We could just hire you with your employment authorization, because those usually are unrestricted. But if you just have an I-140, and you haven't started that process yet, then we would have to hire you on an H-1B or a TN if you're eligible, or OPT first and then one of those. But it shouldn't change anything. Essentially, like, people are allowed to have multiple I-140s approved at the same time. What could potentially change is, maybe it wouldn't make sense for your practice owner to start a perm for you because, you already have that underway, or, that's the only thing that I could, see as a difference. But in generally speaking, we would treat you, depending on your case, what is your current visa? If you're OPT, H-1B, or, if you're eligible for a TN, we just treat you as any other, H-1B, TN, OPT candidate. And then, obviously with the perk that you already have an I-140 approved.
Awesome. When we do start the perm process, can my dependent then work in the States while I wait? Also, if the application made for both myself and my spouse for the green cards simultaneously, can they do both simultaneously?
Yeah, so let me do the first question. So so now when we start the perm process, your spouse, and assuming you are an H-1B, because, I don't know what's your status. So or which status you're inquiring for. But let's just say you are inquiring because you have an H-1B, and, in that specific case, your spouse wouldn't be eligible to work unless they have an unconnected, unrelated employment authorization. They wouldn't be able to work as an H-1B dependent. The H-1B visa dependent is the H-4. So in an H-4, someone can only work when their the H-1B primary holder has an I-140 approved and they are an Indian or Chinese national. So let's just say you are an Indian or Chinese national, and then your spouse would have to wait until your I-140 is approved. So that means, not right when we start the perm, your spouse would be eligible to start working. Your spouse would be eligible to start working when we advance a little bit in the process. These days, unfortunately, not because of us, but because of essentially the pandemic, it's taking like a year and a half to 2 years sometimes for someone to get to the I-140 approval stage. And that's because of the Department of Labor. We have to go through various steps, and I don't want to get into too much details about the perm process. But we have to wait for the Department of Labor to process, a couple of those steps, and they're taking 6 months plus to each of these steps. So then your spouse would have to wait until you get the I-140. And then when you asked, was also if my application made for both myself. Yeah, so the way that the perm process works is like the perm process will be, an employer-sponsored, green card process for the employee. How does, family join is like when you get to that stage when you can actually file for the green card, then you are allowed to just, bring family members. That's just, you have kids who were born outside of the US and they're under, 21, then they could also be, you're dependent in that application. So the perm process is not like, a sponsorship that's made for employee plus a spouse. It's the process for the employee, and their spouse eventually will be eligible to just kind of follow to join that application.
Fantastic. I've got another one. It says, if not Indian or Chinese, is H4 allowed to work?
Unfortunately not. That's the general rule, is that H4s are not allowed to work in the US unless, their H-1B primary visa holder has to wait longer than, usually for the green card. So that's the only exception that I am aware of for H4s, unfortunately. And I don't think there's any other.
All right, this one has 3 questions. I'll ask them all separately. The first one is, does Aspen sponsor H-2B visas?
Good question. We don't, just because H-2B visas are like, for seasonal workers. They're very specific for certain areas and certain scenarios. And Aspen, Aspen employment does not qualify for H-1B, H-2B, sorry.
The next one, and I think you may have just answered it with that, but do we do anything for the position of dental assistant?
Unfortunately not. That's something that we wish we could do more, but essentially we cannot file for TN or H-1B, which are the most common visas that we process, because as I mentioned on my initial slide for TN, there's a list of occupations. So it's not every profession that will qualify for a TN. There's a list of certain professions that would qualify for a TN, and that's precisely because of the NAFTA agreement and that exchange of specialized knowledge in between countries. So dental assistant is not in that list. For H-1B so for H-1B positions, traditionally what immigration services consider a specialty occupation are positions that traditionally require at least a bachelor's degree. Unfortunately, in the US, dental assistant positions do not traditionally require a bachelor's degree. So therefore, we could not make a case with the immigration services that dental assistant isn't a specialized knowledge under their specific requirements. I'm not saying it's not, it probably is, but under immigration services eyes and for their purposes, dental assistant positions are not considered specialized knowledge.
Great. This one has some background that they're giving us and a pretty specific question. So I'm going to be going into orthodontic residency and will be there Monday through Friday. Would it be possible to work for Aspen part-time and work towards a perm while my residency during my residency, which is 2.5 years? So I would be a Canadian citizen living in the States 6.5 years at that point. Is there any way to speed up the process towards a perm residence, while I'm in dental ortho residency?
That's a really good question. So unfortunately not, just because, as I said, the perm process is really specific. So if you're going through residency, I'm assuming, you know, we wouldn't know exactly where we would permanently place you until you graduate. Even if you're working part-time, perm positions, they have to be full-time. That's the number one requirement. Number two, we wouldn't know where we would permanently place you after graduation. So it would be way too risky to just start a perm for you. Then, you know, that would be, then when you graduate, you're going to be joining a completely different location. We would have to then restart the entire process all over again. So, you know, you could expedite somehow. Let's just say you qualify for a national interest waiver, which is the NIW. Or let's just say you have been doing a lot of research, your research is really, really impactful. And, you know, you publish a lot of papers, you have a lot of citations, you may qualify for a green card under EB1, which is the extraordinary ability. But, you know, essentially what you could do to expedite in that specific situation would be, or speed up the process of your part, like, you know, of you to get through the green card, would be trying to file for what we call self-petition, you know, green cards, which would be exactly the EB1 and the national interest waiver. Just by way of context, national interest waiver and EB1 can be filed by an employer, or can be filed, can be self-petition. So the employee, the foreign national could self-petition for EB1 and national interest waiver. So those are the only options, you know, I see.
Fantastic. I don't see any other questions that have come in. If you didn't get your question answered, feel free to type it real fast for us. But it's always good having you. You know how much the international and advanced standing students mean to Aspen Dental. And it's always so great to have you spend time talking to them and answering these questions, because I know we get them in the field and we can answer the real basic ones. You train us on that, but some of the more complicated ones we're getting today, it's just really great to have you. Everybody's saying thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your questions. And, you know, Emily, feel free to share my, you know, email if you have any follow-up questions. I'm always available. If I do take a little bit longer, and by longer, I mean, like, you know, more than 24 hours to answer, is just because we're going through the H-1B lottery season. So, you know, my response time is a little bit longer during this specific time frame, but I usually respond to everyone. So, you know, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. So yeah, so thank you so much for having me, actually.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I'll send a follow-up email with Juliana's information so you have it, or her email so you have it. And if everything's gone right with the recording, I'll also send you the recording just so you have it as a resource. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Juliana.
Thank you, guys. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Does it let you stop? Ooh.